The winter of 1883 came down on the Dakota plains like a hammer of ice. It was not a gentle arrival, not a slow dusting of snow that promised quiet, cozy days. It was a declaration of war from the sky. The wind, born in the frozen heart of the north, scoured the land, carrying with it a cold so profound it felt like a physical presence, a thief that slipped through the stoutest walls and stole the breath from your lungs. It was a cold that did not knock before it entered. For the settlers in the small, hopeful valley of Providence, it was their third such winter, and they believed they were prepared. They had built their homes from the plentiful timber that grew along the river bend, sturdy frame houses with pitched roofs and stone fireplaces. They had stacked cords of wood high against their walls, laid in barrels of salted meat and sacks of flour. They had faced the cold before and had survived. They believed they knew the enemy. They were wrong. This winter was different. It was a beast of another breed, with teeth of glass and a roar that shook the very foundations of their resolve. The cold found its way through every crack and seam. It coated the inside of windows with a thick, opaque layer of frost that no fire could melt. It crept across the floorboards, a tangible chill that numbed the feet through 2 pairs of woolen socks. Drafts moved through the cabins, not like gentle sighs, but like knives, sharp and deliberate. Families huddled close to their hearths, feeding the hungry flames constantly, yet the warmth seemed to extend only a few feet before being devoured by the ravenous cold that owned the rest of the room. The woodpiles, which had looked like mountains in the autumn, shrank with alarming speed, becoming mere hills, then mounds, then scattered logs. In a community defined by shared struggle, the problem was universal. The miller, whose house was the largest, found his great room uninhabitable, forcing his family of 6 into the kitchen. The blacksmith, a man of immense strength, confessed to the preacher that he feared his children would not see the spring. He spent his nights pacing, stuffing rags into the ever-present gaps in his walls, a futile gesture against an invisible, relentless siege. They all followed the same flawed logic, the same tradition brought from the gentler climates of the East. Build with wood, build tall, and fight the cold with fire. It was how a proper house was made. It was the mark of civilization on a wild land, and it was failing. Amidst this shared, escalating desperation, there was one who did not follow the common wisdom. Ilara, a widow who had arrived 2 years prior with her 2 young children, was seen as an outsider. Her husband, a quiet man who had died of a fever their first summer, had been an army engineer from the old country, a place of brutal winters and vast, treeless steppes. He had filled her head not with dreams of tall wooden houses, but with talk of thermal mass, wind profiles, and the insulating power of the earth itself. He had left behind a small crate of books filled with diagrams of strange, low-slung structures, half buried in the ground. Ilara was a quiet woman, observant and methodical. She watched the other settlers struggle. She saw the way the wind tore at their high-peaked roofs and how the cold leached through their thin wooden walls. She felt the same biting chill in her own small, hastily built cabin and knew it was a losing battle. Her woodpile was smaller than most, her resources more meager. Her children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 5, were her entire world. Their coughs in the night were a constant, terrifying reminder of her vulnerability. Survival was not an abstract concept. It was a duty, a sacred promise to the man she had lost. One morning, after a night spent listening to the wind howl like a famished wolf, she made a decision. She walked to a gentle, south-facing slope at the edge of her property, a place the winter sun touched for a few precious hours each day. With a stick, she began to draw a shape in the thin, frozen layer of snow. It was not a square, the footprint of every other house in the valley. It was a long rectangle, oriented east to west. The men from the community, heading out to check their traps, stopped and watched. They saw her scratching in the dirt, her face grim with a concentration they could not comprehend. That afternoon, she revealed her idea. She spoke to Silas, the valley's most respected builder, a man whose opinion carried the weight of hammered steel. She explained that she intended to dig. She would build her home not upon the earth, but within it. A dugout, a sod house. The front wall, facing south, would have windows to catch the low winter sun. The other 3 walls and the roof would be the earth itself, a thick, insulating blanket of soil and prairie grass. The earth holds a steady temperature, she explained, her voice soft but firm, quoting a line from one of her husband's books. It does not fight the cold, it embraces it and tames it. Silas stared at her as if she had proposed living in a well. He was a master of the frame house, a craftsman who could join timbers so perfectly a knife blade could not fit between them. His houses were symbols of progress, of man's dominion over the wild. He looked at her strange drawing, at her small, determined frame, and he laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, not at first. It was the deep, rumbling laugh of a man who has heard a child's fanciful notion. "A hole in the ground?" he said, shaking his head. "Woman, you're talking about a root cellar, a den for a badger. People don't live in holes." His sentiment echoed through the valley. The idea was met with a wave of derision and disbelief. At the general store, the men gathered around the pot-bellied stove and mocked her plan. "Heard the widow is digging her own grave," one chuckled. "Saves the rest of us the trouble come spring." Another added, "She'll be living with the moles and the gophers. Hope she learns to enjoy a diet of worms." They called it Ilara's folly. The women were kinder, but their pity was perhaps worse than the men's scorn. They visited her, bringing small gifts of bread and broth, their eyes filled with a sad concern. "Dear, you must not do this," one pleaded. "It is not proper. It is not safe. The roof will collapse. You will be buried alive." They saw her decision not as an act of innovative survival, but as a symptom of grief, a mind unmoored by loss. They warned her of the damp, of snakes, of the shame of living in a house made of dirt. A house, they argued, was meant to stand tall, to shed the snow from a steep roof, to declare its presence. What she proposed was an act of surrender, a shameful burrowing into the ground, as if she were an animal, not a civilized person. It was an affront to everything they were trying to build in that valley. Their warnings were relentless, a chorus of doubt that followed her from the store to the church. But their words were like the wind against a mountain. They could not move her. She had her husband's books, her own observations, and the chilling sound of her children's coughing. Her desperation was a stronger force than their doubt. She thanked them for their concern, and then she picked up her spade. The work began. It was a lonely, arduous task. The ground was frozen solid, a shield of iron that resisted her every effort. The first few days, she made barely a dent, chipping away at the earth, her progress measured in inches. The sound of her spade striking the frozen soil was a sharp, lonely report in the vast, cold silence. The men would pass on their way to the woods, axes over their shoulders, and they would see her, a small figure wrapped in shawls, fighting a battle with the land itself. They would shake their heads and walk on, their belief in her foolishness reaffirmed. She worked with a quiet, relentless diligence. She would rise before the sun, her first task to stoke the fire in her failing cabin to warm milk for the children. She would leave her son, Samuel, in charge of his younger sister, Sarah, with a stern but loving command to keep the fire fed and the door barred. Then she would step out into the searing cold and return to her digging. Her hands, raw and blistered, even through thick gloves, ached with a pain that settled deep in the bone. Her back screamed in protest, but every swing of the pickaxe, every shovelful of unyielding earth, was an act of defiance. It was a prayer made of sweat and toil. While Elara labored at her pit in the ground, the rest of the community was engaged in their own winter preparations, a flurry of activity that stood in stark contrast to her slow, methodical work. Silas and his crew were finishing a new barn for the preacher, racing against the first heavy snow. The air rang with the sound of their hammers, a quick, confident rhythm that spoke of experience and tradition. They raised the walls with practiced efficiency, fitting the beams and trusses with a speed that was both impressive and, in its own way, reckless. They were building as they always had, relying on speed and familiar forms, paying no mind to the unusual ferocity of the cold that was already settling in. They were focused on the structure, not the physics of the air that would fill it. Other families doubled their efforts along familiar lines. They caulked the seams of their cabins with mud and moss, a task they performed every autumn. They nailed heavy hides over their doors and stuffed straw into the gaps in their window frames. They were treating the symptoms of their problem, not the cause. They saw the cold as an intruder to be barred, not as a fundamental condition of the world to be understood and accommodated. Their work was a frantic patching of a leaking ship, while Elara was attempting to build a submarine. Her isolation was complete. She was not just working alone, she was thinking alone. As she dug deeper, the nature of her work began to change. Below the frost line, the earth softened. It became pliable, a material to be shaped rather than shattered. This was the earth her husband's books had described, a substance with its own innate warmth, a vast reservoir of stability. She carefully squared the corners of the pit, ensuring the walls were straight and true. She was not merely digging a hole, she was sculpting a space. The final dimensions were precise: 24 feet long, 16 feet wide, and 6 feet deep. Next came the most crucial part of the innovation, the part that had earned her the most ridicule: the walls. Using a special spade her husband had designed, she began to cut bricks from the thick prairie sod. These were not clumsy clumps of dirt, but carefully measured blocks, the dense, tangled root systems of the prairie grass providing a powerful, fibrous binder. Each brick was heavy, a solid block of earth that she had to lift and place with painstaking care. She laid them one on top of another on the earthen bank of her excavation, building the walls up another 3 feet above ground level. She did not use mortar in the traditional sense. She packed the seams with a thick clay she found near the riverbed, creating a bond that was nearly seamless and airtight. She was building a house that was almost entirely subterranean. The low profile meant the relentless wind would have little to grip. It would flow over the low, mounded roof instead of battering against flat, vertical walls. The 3-foot sod walls above ground, combined with the 6 feet of earth below, created a barrier of insulation nearly 10 feet thick on 3 sides. It was a fortress of soil. The front wall, facing south, was different. She framed it with timber she salvaged from an old collapsed shed. Here, she installed 2 small windows, set deep into the wall to minimize heat loss, and a single, heavy door. The genius was in the roof. She laid thick timbers across the span, covered them with willow branches, a layer of prairie hay for insulation, and then, finally, she replaced the sod, creating a living roof that would become part of the landscape itself. Her final innovation was the chimney. Instead of a large, open hearth that would suck the warm air from the room, she built a small, efficient cast-iron stove near the center of the space. The flue pipe was her husband's design, a long, horizontal run that snaked through a carefully constructed clay and rock bench before exiting vertically through the roof. This warming bench, as the book called it, was designed to capture the heat that would normally be lost up the chimney. The hot smoke would warm the entire mass of the bench, which would then slowly, gently radiate that heat back into the room for hours, long after the fire itself had died down. It was a simple, elegant system for hoarding warmth. While her neighbors burned through logs as fast as they could split them, she was designing a system to extract every last calorie of heat from a single piece of wood. Her work was slow, deliberate, and based on principles her neighbors had never even considered. They saw a woman digging a hole. She saw a solution. The great storm arrived not with a sudden clap of thunder, but with a terrifying stillness. For a full day, the wind died down, and the sky turned a strange, luminous gray. The air grew heavy, and an unnatural silence fell over the valley, broken only by the nervous lowing of cattle in their barns. The old-timers looked to the sky and felt a primal fear. They had seen this before, but not in a generation. It was the harbinger of a true blizzard, a white death that could last for days. They rushed to make their final preparations, securing livestock and carrying in the last armloads of wood. There was a frantic, panicked energy in the air. Then the wind returned. It came back like a physical blow, a solid wall of force and ice particles that instantly erased the world. Visibility dropped to zero. The sun vanished. The sky and the earth merged into a single, swirling vortex of white. The temperature plummeted. It fell 10 degrees in an hour, then 20, then 30. It settled into a cold, so deep and so absolute that it felt like the end of the world. Metal became brittle enough to snap. Trees groaned and cracked under the strain. It was a storm that did not just rage, it consumed. Inside the frame houses of Providence, the battle for survival began in earnest. The wind, now a constant, shrieking banshee, forced its way through the walls. It was a relentless, physical assault. The fine, flour-like snow was driven through microscopic cracks, accumulating in ghostly white drifts on the floors and windowsills. The heat from the fireplaces was no match for the onslaught. The fires roared, consuming wood at a terrifying rate. But the warmth was stolen as soon as it was created. The cabins grew dangerously cold. Water froze in buckets just feet from the hearth. Ink froze in its wells. The very air felt thin and sharp, painful to breathe. For Silas, the master builder, it was a waking nightmare. His house, the best built in the valley, was failing. The walls groaned under the pressure of the wind. He could hear the nails straining in the timbers. He and his wife stuffed blankets, clothes, anything they could find, into the cracks around the doors and windows, but it was a hopeless effort. The cold was a flood, and they were trying to stop it with their bare hands. They moved their children's beds as close to the fire as they dared, but the children still shivered uncontrollably under piles of blankets. Silas stood before his hearth, a grim sentinel, feeding log after log into the flames, watching his family's lifeline disappear into smoke and ash. He felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the dread of a proud man forced to confront the limits of his knowledge. He had built a beautiful house, but he had not built a shelter. Meanwhile, in Alara's dugout, the world was different. The storm was not a shrieking invader. It was a distant, muffled roar, the sound of a faraway ocean. The wind flowed harmlessly over the low, snow-covered roof. The earth, with its immense thermal mass, held the steady, gentle warmth of the small fire in the stove. There were no drafts. The air was still and calm. The temperature inside held at a steady 60 degrees, a tropical paradise compared to the Arctic conditions in the cabins above ground. The warming bench, the object of so much ridicule, was performing its function perfectly. It radiated a constant, gentle heat that filled the entire space. Ilara had to add only a small log to the stove every few hours. Her children, Samuel and Sarah, were not huddled in fear. They were playing a game with carved wooden animals on the floor. Later, they slept peacefully in their beds, their breathing even and untroubled. The snow that buried their home was not a threat. It was an extra layer of insulation, a final blanket tucked around them by the storm itself. Ilara sat in a simple chair, mending a sock, listening to the muffled fury of the storm outside. She was not afraid. She was warm. She was safe. Her creation was being tested by the worst the world could throw at it. And it was holding. The storm raged for 3 days. On the third day, Silas's woodpile was gone. He had burned through a month's supply in 72 hours. The fire in his hearth dwindled to a small, pathetic bed of glowing embers. The temperature inside his house had dropped below freezing. Frost now covered the walls not in delicate patterns, but in a thick, solid sheet of ice. His wife was trying to keep their 2 young daughters warm by huddling with them under a mountain of quilts. But their lips were blue, their shivering violent and frightening. Desperation gnawed at him. He looked at his failing house, at the ice-caked walls he had built with such pride, and he knew he had been defeated. He was wrong. That single, devastating thought echoed in the frozen silence of his home. He was wrong. A new fear, more potent than the cold, seized him. The fear of losing his family. There was only one place to go, one possibility he had ridiculed and dismissed. Swallowing the bitter taste of his pride, a pride that now felt like a foolish indulgence, he made a decision. He bundled his wife and children in every remaining piece of cloth, wrapped their faces until only their eyes were visible, and prepared to venture out into the white abyss. The journey was only 200 yards, but it might as well have been 200 miles. The wind knocked him off his feet twice. The air was so cold it seared his lungs. He could not see. He could only feel his way, navigating by memory and desperation, his children held tight in his arms. He finally stumbled against the low mound he knew to be Ilara's home. He found the door, a dark rectangle barely visible in the swirling snow, and pounded on it with a frozen fist. When Ilara opened it, the contrast was so stark it was physically shocking. A wave of calm, steady warmth washed over him, a smell of baking bread and dry herbs. It was the smell of life. He saw not a dark, damp hole, but a clean, well-lit room, the air still and breathable. Her children were sitting at a small table, drawing on a piece of slate. He stood there, a man of ice and desperation, on the threshold of a haven, and for a moment he could not speak. He was speechless with the sheer, undeniable reality of her success and his own catastrophic failure. Ilara did not say a word of reproach. She saw the state of his family, the fear in his eyes, and her expression was one of quiet compassion. There was no triumph in her gaze, no hint of, "I told you so." She simply stepped aside. "Come in," she said, her voice calm and even. "There is stew on the stove. Bring your family to the warmth." He stumbled inside, his wife and daughters collapsing onto the clay bench that radiated a miraculous heat. He looked around the small space, at the smooth, clay-plastered walls, the deep-set windows showing only a wall of white, the steady, efficient little stove. It was not a den. It was not a grave. It was the warmest, safest place he had ever been. He, the master builder, the man who had laughed at her, had been saved by the very thing he had mocked. The humility was as profound and overwhelming as the warmth that was slowly seeping back into his frozen limbs. He sat down on the floor, took off his gloves to warm his hands by the stove, and wept. When the storm finally broke, the world it revealed was white, silent, and transformed. The Valley of Providence looked like the bottom of a frozen sea, buried under immense drifts of snow. Chimneys poked through the white landscape like lonely periscopes. The first people to dig their way out were met with a scene of devastation. Barn roofs had collapsed. Several of the more hastily built cabins had been seriously damaged, their walls breached by the wind. But the most immediate crisis was fuel. Every household was either out of wood or dangerously close. The news of Silas's refuge at the widow's dugout spread like a slow, thawing current. It began when the preacher, having tunneled out of his own home, went to check on Silas, fearing the worst. He found the house empty, cold, and dead. A trail of desperate footprints led him to Alara's mound. He expected to find them all huddled in some miserable hole. Instead, he found them sitting together in the calm warmth, sharing a breakfast of hot porridge. He stood at the door, just as Silas had, utterly stunned into silence. Soon others followed. A slow procession of stunned and shivering neighbors made their way to Alara's home. They came expecting to offer help, to rescue her from her folly. They stayed to marvel. Each person who stepped across her threshold had the same reaction. First, the physical shock of the warmth, a deep, penetrating heat, so different from the scorching, drafty heat of a fireplace. Second, the disbelief. They ran their hands along the smooth, dry interior walls. They stomped on the solid, hard-packed earth floor. They sat on the warming bench, looking at the small stove that used so little wood, and they struggled to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had so firmly believed. The laughter and mockery that had filled the general store were replaced by a profound and humbled silence. Silas became Alara's first and most devoted student. He did not leave when the storm ended. He stayed, watching her, asking questions. He, who had always given the orders on a building site, was now the apprentice. His questions were no longer dismissive. They were urgent, hungry for the knowledge he now understood was essential for their survival. "Why this orientation?" he would ask, pointing to the south-facing windows. "To catch the low winter sun," she would answer simply. "The angle is lowest when the heat is needed most." He would nod, sketching furiously in a small notebook he had brought. "And the sod? Why does it not crumble?" he asked, examining the walls. "The prairie grass," she explained. "Its roots are a web. They have held this soil together for 1,000 years. They are stronger than any mortar." She shared her knowledge freely, without any sense of superiority. She brought out her husband's books, the pages filled with diagrams and calculations, and explained the principles of thermal mass and passive solar design. She showed Silas how the deep eaves of the roof were designed to block the high summer sun, keeping the dugout cool, while allowing the low winter sun to stream in. She explained that the earth itself was their greatest resource, not just something to be cleared away to make room for a proper house. It was a partner in shelter, a vast, stable ally against the extremes of the climate. She taught him not just how to build a structure, but how to see the world differently, to read the language of the sun, the wind, and the soil. Her wisdom was not loud or boastful. It was as quiet and as solid as the house she had built. That spring, the Valley of Providence did not just rebuild, it was reborn. The sound of hammering was still present, but it was now accompanied by the rhythmic thud of spades cutting into the earth. Under the guidance of Alara and a newly humbled Silas, the community began to build anew. They chose their sites carefully, looking for south-facing slopes, digging into the protective embrace of the hillsides. The men who had once laughed at Alara now came to her for advice, asking her to check their plans, to approve the quality of their sod bricks. The landscape of the settlement began to change. The tall, vulnerable frame houses were either retrofitted with thick earthen walls or abandoned altogether. In their place rose the low, graceful mounds of the dugouts, their living roofs greening with the first spring grasses. The homes blended into the landscape, becoming part of it rather than an imposition upon it. The valley began to look less like a scar on the prairie and more like a natural extension of it. The community worked together, a shared sense of purpose, replacing the old, prideful individualism. They were no longer just a collection of families. They were a single organism learning to adapt and survive. The story of the widow's folly that became the valley's salvation traveled beyond the confines of Providence. A surveyor mapping the territory came through the following year and was astonished by what he found. He had seen sod houses before, but they were typically crude, temporary shelters. These were different. They were well-designed, permanent, and remarkably comfortable. He spent a week in the valley, filling his notebooks with sketches and detailed notes, documenting Ilara's designs and the principles behind them. His report, published in an Eastern journal, described a new style of prairie architecture, one born of necessity and quiet genius. He wrote of the warming benches, the strategic orientation, and the incredible efficiency of the homes. The idea began to spread. Settlers in other, newer valleys, hearing the tale or reading the report, began to adopt the methods. The knowledge passed from one homesteader to another, a quiet revolution of common sense and humility spreading across the vast, wind-swept plains. Ilara's dugout, born of desperation and ridicule, became the blueprint for a new way of life, a more intelligent and sustainable way to inhabit a beautiful but unforgiving land. Years later, when the valley was prosperous and the harsh winter of '83 was a story told to grandchildren, Ilara would sit on a simple wooden chair outside her home, now draped in wildflowers. Her own children were grown, living in sod houses of their own. She was no longer the outsider, the foolish widow. She was the matriarch of the valley, a figure of quiet respect and deep wisdom. People still came to her, not just for advice on building, but for guidance on all manner of things. They had learned to trust the woman who listened more than she spoke, who observed the world with a patient and discerning eye. The lesson the valley learned was etched into the very earth they lived in. They had learned that pride was a poor insulator against the cold winds of reality. They had discovered that true strength was not in standing tall and defiant against nature, but in bending to its wisdom, in learning its rhythms, and in finding shelter within its embrace. The greatest innovations often come not from the centers of power and proclaimed expertise, but from the quiet margins, from those who are underestimated and overlooked. True wisdom is not about having all the answers, but about having the humility to ask the right questions and the courage to follow where they lead, even if it means digging a home in the dirt.